So what is the target of the certainty of evidence rating? We're building on an article published in 2017, which really changed the way we look at certainty of evidence ratings in a fairly fundamental way. And the essence of this article was that it's very important to think carefully what we are rating our certainty of evidence in, what the target of the certainty rating is. And in addition to that, to consider when we are rating our certainty, that we are rating it not on the point estimate, but on the consideration of a threshold or a range. We further defined what we think of two different approaches, which we describe as minimally contextualized and partially contextualized. The minimally contextualized approach suggests two possible thresholds. One threshold is the null effect, no difference, and with the null effect of no difference, there we go. With the null effect of no difference, we are rating our certainty that there is an effect that differs from the null. With respect to an alternative within the minimally contextualized approach, we can think of a minimally important difference or a small effect margin, in which on one side we have an important effect and on the other side we have an unimportant effect. And that we think of as the minimally contextualized approach. In the partially contextualized approach, we have more margins. We can think of a MID or small effect threshold, a moderate effect threshold, and a large effect threshold. And that creates four ranges: a trivial effect, a small effect, a moderate effect, and a large effect. So everything I say henceforth will be thinking of this minimally contextualized or partially contextualized approaches. Now, sadly, I'm having trouble finding my cursor to make the change there. I've got it again. Okay, so then when you are rating your certainty, thinking of this particular way of looking at it, first of all, you choose your degree of contextualization, minimally or partially contextualized. Then you choose and set your thresholds. So minimally contextualized, it's the null or the minimally important difference. Partially contextualized, you have the four ratings, and then you think of what range the effect may lie and how you want to rate that. The target of the certainty rating will depend on the position of the point estimate in relation to the chosen thresholds, and then you are going to rate in terms of the certainty of the evidence on precision, which is going to be the focus here, whether the confidence interval crosses your threshold or whether it doesn't. And the remainder of this presentation is going to be providing examples of each of these. So, first of all, the target of the certainty rating will depend on the point estimate in relation to the chosen thresholds. So, consider point estimate A. We may, in the minimally contextualized, rate our certainty that the effect is greater than the null. In the partially contextualized, we may rate our certainty that the effect lies between the MID and the moderate effect threshold. In other words, that there's a small effect. But we could, if we wanted to, also rate our certainty that the effect is less than the large effect. So the point here is that there are at least two choices of thresholds when one is using minimally contextualized. Are we greater than the null or greater than the MID? And a number of options of ranges once we have switched or once we decide on a partially contextualized approach. Consider now B. If we consider B, the point estimate is in the range of a trivial effect. So if we are using a minimally contextualized approach, we may still rate our certainty that there is a non-zero effect. The true effect differs from the null. Or using a minimally contextualized approach, that the effect is less than the MID, or what one might call a trivial effect. Similarly, in the partially contextualized approach, one likely would be rating that the true effect is in the trivial range, but you could also rate, if you wanted to, rate your certainty, for instance, that it's less than a moderate effect. In other words, below the moderate effect threshold. So bottom lines are, we choose minimally or partially contextualized approaches. We look at where the point estimate is in relation to the thresholds. We pick a threshold or range in which we are rating our certainty and proceed according to where the point estimate is, and as you'll see, where the confidence interval is in making our ratings of certainty. So a particular situation arises when the point estimate is very close to the threshold. So let us say that we have picked a minimally contextualized approach, and we're going to rate our certainty relative to the minimally important difference or small effect threshold. And we've chosen a small effect threshold of 1%, and our point estimate is 0.99%, extremely close to that threshold. Two options. One option is to say, well, the point estimate is still less than the MID, so I'm going to rate my certainty that there is a trivial effect, and there now will be a 100% chance that the point estimate, the confidence interval will cross that threshold that we have chosen, and we'll be rating down for imprecision. But alternatively, we could say, okay, this compelling reason to switch to a partially contextualized approach and rate our certainty that the true effect is somewhere between the null and the moderate effect threshold. And if we did that, it's not certain that we're going to be rating down for imprecision. So consider a special situation when the effect is near zero, so near the null effect. And let's say that we take a minimally contextualized approach. Even with the minimally contextualized approach, and we started out by saying we're going to rate our certainty that the effect is not zero. Well, in this particular situation, how do we go about that when the point estimate is so close to the null? What is required now, even in the minimally contextualized approach, is to identify an MID or small effective threshold for the benefit and an MID or small effect threshold for harm. And one will then be rating one's certainty that there is no effect or a trivial effect. In other words, one is rating our certainty that the truth lies somewhere between the MID for the benefit and the MID for harm, and we may be more or less certain about that depending on what happens with the confidence interval. One of the points that emerges relatively obviously from all of this is it's going to depend where you set your threshold. And for the minimally important difference or for small or large effects, that is a decision call. And grade is still working on helping people applying grade to decide on what the thresholds, but that's outside of the boundary. But in this instance, if you picked MID1, you would be rating your certainty that the truth is an important effect that is greater than the MID. If you picked MID2, you would be rating your certainty that the effect is unimportant or trivial, less than the MID. We've also identified a situation when you may not bother to rate your certainty according to a specific threshold, and that is if the confidence interval is extremely wide and, for instance, includes a large benefit and a large harm. Under those circumstances, it doesn't make a lot of sense to rate one's certainty according to a particular threshold. And this is one of the situations where we, for the first time, are going to be recommending rating down 3 levels for imprecision and just saying we have we're very uncertain of the magnitude of the effect. Where one sets that threshold is, again, a matter of judgment. And one could say if it just crosses the MID for harm and the large effect threshold for benefit, that's wide enough to rate down for 3 levels. So here again, illustrating with confidence intervals. So let's say one takes a minimally contextualized approach and rates our certainty in relation to the null. In situation A, you're not going to rate down for imprecision. It doesn't cross null. If you decide in A to rate your certainty that the effect is greater than the MID, because that's where the point estimate lies, you will still not rate down because the entire confidence interval lies above your threshold. In situation B, however, if you chose to rate your certainty in a minimally contextualized approach that the true effect lies above the null, then you will not rate down for imprecision because the confidence interval doesn't cross that threshold. On the other hand, if you decided within the minimally contextualized approach to rate your certainty that the true effect lies above the MID because the confidence interval crosses your threshold, you are going to rate down for imprecision. Here is a real-world example. It comes from patients with sepsis, whether or not they should receive corticosteroids or not receive corticosteroids. We have an example here where the outcome is short-term mortality, and you see the point estimate of the risk difference and the confidence intervals. Let's assume you pick a minimally contextualized approach, and you are rating your certainty there's a non-zero effect. You will then say that we need to rate down for precision because our confidence interval crosses the no difference threshold. So this would be minimally contextualized, null effect threshold. Corticosteroids have an effect on mortality reduction is what we're postulating, and we rate down for imprecision. Let us say that instead, and we still take a minimally contextualized approach, but we now say, what is the likelihood that there's an important difference greater than the MID or the small effect threshold? Here, the point estimate lies above that threshold, so we're going to be rating our certainty that there's an important effect greater than the MID, and we're going to rate down for imprecision because it crosses the threshold of a small effect or MID. Another possibility is that we still use a minimally contextualized approach, but we have a different small effect threshold, and that's at 2%. Now our point estimate rise below the MID or small effect threshold, and as a result, we are going to be rating our certainty that there is a trivial effect of the intervention, not an important effect, but once again, we will be rating down for imprecision because our confidence interval crosses our chosen threshold. Finally, we could be using a partially contextualized approach. We could rate our certainty that there's a small effect because the point estimate lies between the small and moderate effect threshold, and again, rate down for imprecision because it crosses both boundaries of the range defining small and moderate effect. In conclusion, the principles we've laid out are based on prior grade guidance laid out in the 2017 Monica Holtkrantz paper. which tells us that we will never be rating our certainties in the point estimate, but rather in relation to a threshold or range. What the most recent grade guidance that I've taken you through that's been accepted as grade guidance, not, I think, just about the paper just about to be submitted, it gives more specific suggestions, excuse me, it gives more specific suggestions for the target of the certainty rating, which we've found often extremely helpful in clarifying our imprecision judgments. So that's the end of the presentation, and we can get rid of the slides if that's appropriate.
Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, that's fine. We've got a few questions coming in, if I may. One from Kurt. Earlier you discriminated between minimally, stroke partially, stroke fully contextualize, and using the MID as a threshold was called minimally contextualized. Is this correct? And if so, why did you change this?
Yes, okay, nice pickup. What we decided to do when we started to apply this to network meta-analysis, we found that it was useful to lump together, if you will, the null effect as a threshold and the MID as a threshold. And that just was really a matter of convenience for applying the minimally and partially contextualized within the context of network meta-analysis. And that's why we chose it. So it's just a matter of semantics, really. You're thinking of the null as a possible threshold. You're thinking of the MID as a possible threshold. And we called the null non-contextualized in Monica's paper. But now we've grouped those two together. It's really just a semantic issue that we're now calling this minimally contextualized, and within minimally contextualized, you can choose the null or the MID as your threshold.
Thanks, Gordon. One final question before we move on. This is from George. If we set mid after the review is performed, not when writing the protocol, should we avoid using the mid as a reason for rating down due to imprecision?
No. It is perfectly reasonable, in my view anyway, to make decisions about these thresholds, not necessarily when you're planning your review, because the results might affect things. What I've started to do I've found that there are many, many situations in which definitive decisions are unwise to be made at the time of protocol writing. As much as possible, I try to think of what these circumstances might be, and for instance, put in the protocol. Having looked at the results, we will decide on the optimal setting of the MID threshold, or if you're partially contextualized, the small, moderate, and large. Very often, you're going to need to be looking at the results to make a sensible decision. So, and then if you're worried about somebody saying, you haven't said that in the protocol, then the protocol, if you can anticipate that, will say, we're going to be making this decision later on when we have more insight on the basis of the results. And then you are following the protocol when you make that decision subsequently.